This week's parsha has something great. One of the most important psukim for our times, which is, at least according to the annual cycle, but for those of us in Chutz La'aretz, we found I talk about the triennial cycle, and people are confused. Like, isn't this week's parsha? You're talking about Bereshis. Aren't we in Devarim? You're confused. They post it late. No, so we stick mostly to the annual cycle. We have to talk about it because that's what they do. Also on Shabbos, they don't talk about the triennial cycle. Why not? Because no one around on Shabbos is discussing that, and they just read. We sat down last week. I was talking about Ray. Why? Because they just read it at Mincha. So that's what we do. L'shechno tidrashu v'afa shama. It says seek out God's dwelling place, right, and go there, seek it out, and that's actually been the source for something I'm going to put on the screen over here. There's a hekshare of the psukim that you can see in Rashi that seems to say that we're supposed to only build a temple in certain circumstances. So I'm going to put this here. I didn't even make a PDF of it. I was so excited. I was adding to it before. And I put this on the screen. You could come around here if you want to see this side. Or at least I put it on the screen. I don't know if I printed or something.
What is it?
This is a source sheet. I make source sheets sometimes because I want to keep my thoughts in order.
So you did send me.
Yeah, I can send it here. Hold on 1 second. Watch this. Anybody want to get their own copy of this? Just raise your hand virtually, and we'll send it along. I'll send it to the group. You guys can see me exporting this out. Here it goes. I'm sending it to the group Machon Shilo discussion. Okay, because I figure most of you are part of that group. Bam. Okay, it's sent. It's now in hyperspace. Here's a teaching that I heard quite a few times. I know that some rabbis have said this explicitly, that the time has not yet come to build a Beis Hamikdash. I was actually in shul in this neighborhood. I had a few minutes to talk before Mariv, and I gave the other side of the story first. The opinion that says, Achronim of today say, in our current state of affairs, it's still not time to build a Beis Hamikdash. Assuming there is a mitzvah. We're not supposed to build a Beis Hamikdash because we're not at peace. Okay? We haven't achieved the peace that is necessary for us to become even obligated to build a temple. Who's sending me a message? What? Oh, good, because there's actually pretty solid source for such an idea. Okay, we're gonna play devil's advocate, and this is what people get from reading this week's parsha and the passage in Sanhedrin and what Rashi says, because most people are familiar with what Rashi says. We would be allowed to, but maybe it's not even right. There are some who would say that perhaps you're not supposed to. You're not supposed to build a temple. The time isn't right, and as we shall see, we'll read the sources and we'll see what they're talking about. Okay, this is in the Sifrei also. The Sifrei is brought in Sanhedrin, so most people are more familiar with Gemara because people learn Daf Yomi, they go in yeshiva. Although Sanhedrin is not something you learn in yeshiva; it's not a yeshivish mesechta. So in order to learn this, you have to be a matmid, or you have to actually go to Daf Yomi or something like that. But if you're just you have to be a weirdo. Yes, I know a few guys who finish Shas. I'm very jealous of them. Like really, they know it well. They have good bikias in learning it. And smartest guy I know, he became a rocket scientist. He might, I don't know. It's a tough call, but the toss up between him and another. See, the other guy I think is the smartest guy I know, but he's not a rocket scientist. Okay, the other guy I know is a rocket scientist, but he doesn't come across as smarter than this other guy who probably has a really high IQ. But he's a real genius. So he finished Shas in his early 20s and then a few other times. Okay, so I was privileged to call him a friend. So it says in this week's parsha, Lo ta'asun k'chol asher anachnu osim kol hayom, ish kol yashar b'nav. Don't do like we're doing today. Everybody does whatever he wants. This is talking about, generally speaking, the way the service was in the olden days. That is, you could build your. Hold on 1 second. Got a message. Family issue. Is everybody okay? Hold on. Okay. Here we go. Sorry about that. We've talked about the Heter Bamos before. Moshe Rabbeinu was saying that there are periods in Jewish history, and let's say the time of the Avos, where you could build your own backyard altar and offer sacrifice to God. But that's not the ideal situation. You're supposed to have a permanent temple. So Moshe Rabbeinu says, if you have a heter bamos, technically you'll go into the land of Israel, and you'll be able to do wherever you want. You can build yourself a mizbeach and offer sacrifice there. Why? Kilo vathem ad ata, because until now you have not yet arrived. El ha-menucha, you haven't arrived at the resting place and the heritage or the portion that God is giving to you. So Chazal say menucha nachla. Menucha means the time when the sanctuary was at Shiloh, and nachla is when it's in Jerusalem. And during those times, sacrifice anywhere was forbidden. You could only go to the actual sanctuary to offer sacrifice. One mizbeach, like the Maharal says, we're going to see, God willing, in the next year, what the Maharal says about this. One mizbeach, one people, one God. Okay? So you're not supposed to do that. But, as I'll say, there's a drasha. Before you get to the menucha, and between the menucha and menachla, you will be able to offer sacrifice at your own backyard altar. You won't need a kohen to do it for you. You could build this, and they'll make many of them. Moshe Rabbeinu continues, you'll cross over the Jordan, you'll dwell in the land that the Lord your God is portioning to you, use plural, and he will give you respite or respite, okay, from all your enemies around you, and you will dwell securely. Right? First, get into the land, he describes things. Go into the Jordan, dwell in the land, and then you'll have peacetime. And then find the place that your Lord your God shall choose. Right? And that's where you should bring your sacrifices. And the pasuk continues, other things you bring to the temple. Now, I'd like to point out that we've discussed the sugya before. Basically, when the Mishkan was in Gilgal, the first 14 years, the Israelites were in the land of Canaan. And in the intervening 57 years, according to Seder Olam's count, that between when the Mishkan at Shilo was destroyed and the first temple was built, the Mishkan was in Nov and Givon. During those times, those places weren't considered chosen by God. Those were not Menucha, not Nachla, and therefore sacrifice could be offered elsewhere, even though the public sacrifices were offered in the Mishkan. And the Mishkan stood exactly as it had been built by Moshe Rabbeinu. That's what's described in Divrei Yomim and Sefer Malachim. When King Solomon took the throne, I was showing this to my son yesterday. We were traveling too long. King Solomon, but when he took the throne, went to Givon to the sanctuary. It says the sanctuary that B'Tzalel had built in Moses' time. That's what you found in Givon. The same altar, the same bronze altar, okay, the same tent, the golden boards. It was all there. The menorah, the lechem, the shulchan. It was all there. That's what they had in the desert, and that's where the Kohanim were in charge of the Korban Tamid and the Musaf, and that's where the Leviim sang the Shir Shel Yom. That's where that's where they did the temple service. And Solomon himself brought 1,000 burnt offerings there when he became king. That was the temple, except that wasn't chosen by God, and therefore you could also have other altars anywhere else in the land of Israel, like King David had his own personal altar in Jerusalem. That was the situation. So the connection here is, and we're going to see in the Gemara, that it's basically saying that the time will come to find the place where God will choose the temple, where to put the temple. That time will come once you are in the land and you have Heiniach Lachem Yisaviv. Let's read what Rabbi Yossi says. Tanya Rabbi Yossi Omer. Okay, Bryson, what does Rabbi Yossi say? Well, it was in Shlomo's time. Well, hold on one second. Don't get to this. First, understand what's in the Gemara. Understand what Rashi says, and then we'll see that it's not exactly the way they present it. Okay, because Rashi changes things around. You can actually see what Rashi says here. Okay, Rashi paraphrases it, which is different than the Gemara, which is the jumping point for the other Shita. Well, let's understand the other Shita because it's Torah. Okay. Shalosh mitzvot nitztavu Yisrael b'chnisatan la'aretz. 3 commandments that Israel was given when they come into land. La'amid melech, la'achriz zarosh Amalek, to appoint a king, destroy the seed of Amalek, v'livnoth lahem beit ha'bechira, and to then build for themselves the chosen house. Why called Bechira? Because throughout Parshas Re'eh in the next Parsha, the temple is referred to as the place God shall choose, which is a very interesting thing. I'm going to say this now so I don't forget it. There are 2 dinim in temples. The first is the physical Mishkan. That's the structure where you have to have all the mitzvahs there. And then there's the location. You need a combination of the physical structure, like the Rambam says, a Kodesh and a Kodesh Kodashim and a Kior in front of the Mizbeach, which could be moved, by the way. Those are technically movable, and they were movable for the first 4 centuries. And then there's the place where they are located. Both are required. Once both were firmly combined and said, this is it, now that's considered permanent. But for large part of Jewish history, it was not. Okay, there's the place, and then there's this.
Right now, we need a specific place within this bill.
Well, yeah, you need a very specific place. It's mechuvan me'od, as Rambam says, and the side of the Kodesh Kodashim is also, that's the Kodesh Kodashim, even if the walls are not standing, which was not the case earlier. The Kodesh Kodashim was whatever was inside the tent. There was no Navi who came and told them in Nova Givon, this is exactly where the Mishkan has to be. In the times of Moshe Rabbeinu, where was the Mishkan? It was the center of the Israelite camp. Wherever the cloud stopped, that's where they put the Mishkan. But it wasn't that this place was holy. The second the cloud moved and the tent and the camp moved, that was nothing. It was like Mount Sinai. When God was on Mount Sinai, so it was holy. You couldn't go up there, right? And then the sound of the Yovel, that's the special shofar, and then anybody could go up on the mountain. It's not holy anymore. Okay, limits are off. And also the site where the Holy of Holies stood in Shiloh, that was chosen by God. The Mishkan isn't there. You could walk around there. You could even play soccer there. You could even play soccer in the site of the ancient Mishkan. There's no Kedusha there. I don't even think it would be an affront to God to do that. It's already not there. It says Vayim As. It's already been, that's the opposite of Bechira. Isn't that crazy? Okay. Ironically, thank God, no one does disgrace the place where the Mishkan used to sit in Shiloh. It's an archaeological site. Okay. We go see, that's what it is. It's a piece of history, okay? But it's not holy. Well,
I've been there. It's pretty.
Yeah, it's pretty cool, but it's not holy. Okay, he continues. I don't know the order. Okay, what's first? Kishahu Omer ki yad al kesiyah milchama l'Adonai b'Amalek. It says Moshe Rabbeinu. What he declared that there's God, so to speak, has put his hand on his throne. He's swearing by his throne that there is a holy war, okay? A God's war against Amalek, midor dor, forever. This seems to imply that you're supposed to have the king first before you decide, that's it, get rid of Amalek. Why? Because you see the reference to the thrones. Remember, God swearing by his throne. Where's God's throne? Well, there's the Kisei HaKavod, which is also a very not well understood concept, right? God, so to speak, has a Kisei HaKavod, throne of glory, a heavenly throne of glory, but God also has a throne here in Israel. Where? Shneimar Vayeshev Shlomo al Kisei Hashem lemelech. God's throne in this world is the throne of the king of Israel, the Davidic king that sits in Jerusalem. That's God's throne. And he has allowed David to sit on his throne. So much so that wherever David sits, that's the throne. And that's why David or his successor can sit where? In the Azara. And they represent God sitting on the throne. When the Davidic king is on the throne and doing justice, that is the ultimate representation of God's kingdom in this world. And that's why God gave a special privilege to his chosen ones that they could actually sit in his house. You can't sit in the Heichal. Certainly not. No one can. In the Azara, who's allowed to sit? The Davidic monarch. And only him. Okay. Okay, fine. So king comes first. But what comes after that? Building the temple or destroying Amalek? We I put in all the pasuk here. In your editions of the Gemara, it might have just a shorthand, like Mechule. So you can understand the pasuk they're talking about. I quote it in full. If it says, when do you go to build the temple? Find the place that God shall choose. Once you have peace, God has given you a respite from all your enemies surrounding you. Okay? So Amalek is the enemies who are near you, the worst ones around. Where does Amalek live in relative to Eretz Yisrael? To the south. To the south. So Kal V'chomer, if Amalek is hanging out to your south, ready to attack you, or let's say he was concentrated. I don't know. Just for the sake of example, Amalek was concentrated in the West Bank. and on the northern border and in the Gaza Strip. Let's just say, okay, it doesn't have to be that way. If Amalek was concentrated there and actively trying to kill Am Yisrael, so we'd be in a situation where misaviv, you have the enemy is not giving you a rest. So when God gives you a rest from your enemies around you, including Amalek, so you'll come time to build the temple.
Where do we get the part where it has to be? Man, where do we get the part that has to be all of our enemies, not specifically Amalek?
It says, "Ve'niach lechem kol oivechem." Okay, so if Amalek's there, obviously you still have some of your oivechem around you who are trying to get you. Okay, so Amalek, obviously getting rid of Amalek has to take place first, and they say, and also getting rid of the Canaanim. But that's how are you going to sit in the land if they're there? And it says, "V'chein b'David hu omer." David Amalek was in the same situation. What happened? Once David had dwelled in his house, he brought the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. Everything's okay. Okay, God had given finally rest. Most of the Davidic wars are over. Ironically, afterwards it says that David Amalek engaged in more wars, but that was because the enemies instigated those. The Ammonites decided to, start up a fight, and that led to a whole chain of events. It got the Arameans involved and the Edomians. David Amalek won all of those, but it took some time. Okay, you're not supposed to. Had no reason. Al Tatzar Moab. There was no reason for King David to want to start the fight with Ammon and the Moabites and the Arameans, but the problem was they started with him. Okay, they started the aggressive thing. They really shouldn't have, and they ended up losing. That's why King David's empire was became so vast. But it says about King David that he was finally settled, and then what happened? Says, look, I have a very nice Beit Arazim, means I'm actually in a stone castle here, but it's supported with beams of cedar. That's how you support the walls and the roof, right? Mm-hmm. So I have a very proper house befitting a king, and God's house is just a bunch of boards, makeshift boards with a tent over it. So he's implying, I want to build a similar structure for God. That's what he told the prophet Nathan, who told him, very good idea. You're the king, you're chosen by God, so go build a temple. And then he was told at night, no, tell David to put the brakes on this whole temple idea for whatever reason. Okay, it's a privilege given to his son. So the implication here is that this state of affairs, where it only came time to build a temple, was once King David actually achieved that which was elusive the first 400 years or so, the Jewish people were in the land of Israel, which was a state of peace. And then now let's get around to building the temple. Okay, that's what it seems to say, and that's the way Rashi has it. Okay. Rashi says in this parish on the Torah here, that means he says divide the land and everybody knows where his place is and where his tribe is. When did that happen, by the way? Joshua's time. Okay. Okay, and God gives you a rest. Okay, after you have the conquest and dividing up in the rest time, he quotes this in Shoftim. From all the nations that are still left, they're basically a test. Okay, why? Even that which was achieved in the time of Joshua, in the time of the judges, wasn't good enough for the people to actually turn their attention to what? This finding the place that God shall choose, where the temple is supposed to be. He says, "Ve'ein zot ela b'mei David." Az, and then he continues the next pasuk. Vayamakom b'nu lachem beita bechira b'Yushalayim. Then it comes time to build the base of Bechira in Jerusalem. V'chein hu omer b'David. That's what happened with David. First, he had this, like the Gemara says, he had his rest. He was finally established, and then he had his great proposition to the Navi: let's build a temple. So, based on this, I have heard many times. I don't want to name names because maybe I could be wrong, but you would not be surprised to hear this Vertlach today saying, look, we have an active hot war. If you heard this, let's say a few years ago when there was an illusionary peace, maybe there's someone say, yeah, but we still have our enemies around us, still not time to get, setting our minds to build a temple or make it public policy. It's not on the agenda. Call the Chomer today, when we have a war with Amalek, an active hot war with Amalek, and if, like I said in the shul that night, this is where I stopped. I didn't get to the other side of the story. We have a hot war with Amalek. If you have any doubt who Amalek is today, then you should open up your eyes or enlist in the army. I'm not telling you everybody should enlist, but if you want to see Amalek, go enlist and you could participate in any of many battles against, open Amalekites, right?
Okay.
You could get a taste of that, and you probably have, right? You could tell us who Amalek is, okay? You'd have to be blind. It was like nowadays the open identification of Amalek is almost as easy as telling the high school students back in the day in your school about the Oslo courts. I remember teaching guys about the Oslo courts who were, they're born, in the 2000 or later, right? So you hear about the Oslo courts, you tell them the whole premise of the idea, say that's the stupidest thing I ever heard. It's mind-boggling to tell from the mouths of babes. Now, the beginning of this other side of the story starts with the Rashbam.
Wait,
What?
What would this person say about the time of Ezra?
Come on, you're jumping to the end. That's the last thing we're going to see. But you have to see this in order. Okay. Perusha Rashbam Sham. What does the Rashbam say in that pasuk? Ish Klei Yashar Beinav. Everybody offering sacrifice what he wants. Everybody does what he wants. Free for all. B'chol makom asher chonim sham b'midbar. Shanu chonim sham b'midbar. In one state, we move around in the midbar, in the wilderness. It could be like it says in Parshas Ba'aloscha. Sometimes they would stay put just for a day. Sometimes they'd stay put for many years. They don't know. It's when the cloud or the pillar of fire would pick up. That's when they would go, right? The Levim would have to get to taking apart the Mishkan and moving it to wherever the pillar went. So we're not going to do that. Anu makrivim b'mishkan mitaltel mimakom l'makom. We don't want this idea that we're offering sacrifice in a Mishkan, a sanctuary, that can be moved place to place. There has to be a certain permanence to it. Okay? Can't just be you could take apart the God's temple and just move it somewhere else. Now, I'd like to point out a few facts, going back to what we said before. You're supposed to have a permanence to the Mishkan. What existed in Shilo, according to the Mishnah, as a diuk in the Psukim, was that it was this tabernacle as built by Moses, but it had stone walls. The walls were permanent. The boards with gold were on the inside. They were like, if you walked into the Mishkan, you see them on the inside. The tabernacle at Shiloh lacked the roof. It was the original triple layer tent that was built in Moses' time over a stone facade. And it even had doors at the gates. We say Samuel, as a young Levi, was in charge of opening those gates in the morning, just like they would eventually open up the gates of the temple in Jerusalem. Leviim do that in the morning, right? That's the Leviim's job. So there was a permanence to there. And also, this is another key to what we're going to see here. The temple service continued. In David's time, like I said before, there was a temple, as the Rambam says. The Mishkan was in Givon, and that's where they did all the sacrifices. David didn't say, hey, we're in a state of absolutely no sanctuary. He just wanted to take that sanctuary in Givon and find its permanent location and also make its structure permanent. But it's not like they weren't doing Korban Tamid and lighting the menorah and having Lechem upon him and a kahuna active, or even Korban Pesach. They were doing everything. It says everything that Moshe commanded in the Torah was being done where? In Givon. I'll read you the relative verse in Divrei Yomim which says this. Okay? What?
It would be considered Arai.
It would be considered Arai.
In the Midbar, there was specific, isn't it?
It was whatever was done in the Mishkan, ideally, in the Midbar, what continued in.
No, I'm saying they say that in the Midbar, it was all their dwellings
were right.
Were considered permanent because it was Al Yashim.
Yeah, not exactly. Okay, so let me read you what the verse says. It says David established his altar in Jerusalem. We said that we've seen this verse before. Wayazov Sham. I'll just read this verse. Lifnei Aaron Brit Adonai la'asaf l'chav l'sharet lifnei Aaron tamid lidvar yom b'yomo. David brought the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, so he put Asaph in charge of it. Him and his Levitic brothers were going to be singing a song every day and offering a sacrifice there. Why? Because Leviim, and this is a bumah. Okay? However, as for Tzadok the Kohen and his brethren, the Kohanim, who lived in Givon, remember, the Kohen Gadol who was in Jerusalem was Evyathar, okay, the descendant of Eli. And he had nothing to go home to because his town had been destroyed and his whole family had been killed. Okay.
I'm showing.
Lifnei Mishkan Adonai b'mama asher b'givon. They're in front of the Mishkan of God, the same Mishkan, Moses' Mishkan, at the high place in Givon. La'alot olot la'Adonai am mizbacho la'tamid la'boker v'la'arev. In order to bring burnt offerings to the Lord on the altar of the burnt offering, okay, constantly, evening and afternoon. According to everything that's written in the Torah of the Lord, where Asher Tzival Yisrael, and he commanded Israel, and also had some Levites there who were doing Levitic things, just like it says in the Torah. So I like to. We'll read this in the Rambam. What David HaMelech wasn't saying. Sorry, I'll read this first. I'll read the Rambam, then I'll summarize it. What does the Rambam say? In Hilchos Malachim, he says what we find in the Gemara. There are three mitzvahs that the Jewish people are given. Once again, have a king, destroy Amalek, build the temple, right? And then he says, Minui Melech Kodem La Milchemes Amalek. He used the word Minui instead of Ha'amadab. The same principle. First, appoint the king. Why? It says that, here's interesting. He quotes from Samuel, not exactly we have in our Gemara Sanhedrin. It says the prophet Samuel came to Saul saying, God told me to anoint you as king of Israel. Now go find Amalek. He didn't tell us to any of the other judges who were non-kings before him. You're the monarch now. So I didn't even do this as shofet. Now you're king. Go destroy Amalek. And destroying Amalek precedes building the temple. How do you know? It says David's example. And it was when God had given him rest all around. Right? So he did this. This is a halacha that was thrown in here. The Rambam saying, well, why is it that there was something so wrong about the people asking for a king in Samuel's time if it's a mitzvah? So he gives his basic answer because they did it for the wrong reasons. And now I'm going to give the examples over here indicating, hold on 1 second. Okay. Fine. The examples that we saw before that, wait a minute, Joshua was also king, right?
Yeah.
Right? So here are the examples for those of us who have not been here before. Ein ma'amidim melech tefillah, the Rambam says. Why? Until you have a Beis Din and the Navi and, has to be officially. Like Joshua was appointed by Moses. Joshua's appointment was just exactly how you appoint a king. What's Rambam implying? Joshua was, as Chazal say, king. They also say Moshe Rabbeinu was king. Next, whoever rebels against the king is basically, he's playing with his own life. What's the example? For example, what's the prime example that Rambam brings of a king who can punish those who rebel against him? The authority that Joshua had. That's right in the beginning of his book. Joshua was king in all but name. Next, the Rambam talks about kibush over here, which we saw before. Who's the one who does all the conquering? The king. Eretz Yisrael conquered by the king on behalf of all Israel. Who did it? Joshua. Right? And we also saw over here that the king is supposed to conduct a war. And when the king conducts a war, he's supposed to first offer peace. That is a Torah surrender to the belligerents, right? And who's the one who kept this mitzvah of the king? Who's a prime example of the one who offered peace before fighting the enemy? The king who did this? The only king about whom we have such an example in Tanakh. Who is it? Joshua. 4 examples in the Rambam and the Halachas where Joshua is the king. Okay? So, what is this? Wow, everybody's looking for a piece of meat right now. Okay. I have the book. I have the quote over here from Sefer Yeshua. These psukim are all in order. I just left out the things between them. It says Joshua took all the land. Joshua conquered all the land and gave it out to Israel just like he was supposed to, all the people, according to their divisions and according to their tribes. And the land was quiet from war. That means the war had already subsided. We saw before that this is not a vavaypup. It doesn't say vatish kota aretz mi milchama. That would mean this is what happened afterwards. When it says va'aretz shakatam mi milchama, it's past perfect, meaning it's because the war had already ended. Joshua completed all his wars. It was quiet. No one else is going to be attacking Am Yisrael until well after Joshua's death, right? Peace was achieved. And then it says, "Vayikalu kol adaf b'nei Yisrael Shilo vayashkinu sham et ol moed v'aretz nichbesha lifnehem." Once again, they went all together and they set up the Mishkan, the Ol Moed in Shiloh. It used to be in Gilgal because this is the place that the Navi showed them. This is the place God shall choose, like it says in the Mishnah and the Gemara in a few places. This was the Menucha, and now all the laws of the temple apply to Shiloh. Basically, what we saw in the Gemara in Sanhedrin, that it came time to build the temple. Once there was peace, didn't just apply to David. When did it apply to? Also to Joshua. They could have brought these verses also. Joshua first conquered all land, got rid of all the enemies, and then he set up the temple. Also over here, where the verses continue, a chapter later. Okay? So they gave Joshua his own piece of land. And then it continues, these are the Nachalot that he did. God gave to Israel all the land that he had sworn to give to their ancestors. They inherited it and they dwelled in it. The key verbs. Just the promised. Basically, we had a little bit of a Solomonic / Messianic age in the time of Joshua. Everything was perfect. That's the way it was supposed to be. No man among their enemies stood against them. All their enemies were given into their hand. At the time, there was no, if there were Amaleks, they were not relevant. They were gone. Amalek is only going to become a problem later in Jewish history. Lo nafal davar mikol davar tov asher diber Hashem al Beit Yisrael hakol ba. Lo nafal davar means nothing didn't come true. Everything came true. And by the way, Solomon praises God that they basically got to the state again in his time. That is, the Jewish people got to the peak of their messianic history shortly after Moses has died, 14 years after he had died. And then they had a gigantic falling action. Okay? Slowly, they were backsliding in the times of the judges. So much so they're brought almost to the bottom with a Churban and a Gullus before King David's time. And then they started rising back up again with Samuel, Saul, and ultimately King David, who brought them back to the state where they had been in Solomon's time. And that's when, by the way, the pasuk came true. God will do even better for you. Every time you get back to the top, it'll be even better than the first time around. The first time around, they had a king and a temple, just as God had told them. No one thought that the temple at Shiloh was in any way deficient. That was exactly what God commanded them to do. Except the next time around, when King David was king, now they have a Mashiach ben David, so to speak. Now there's permanence. Now the Mishkan will never move to some other place. Now the entire temple is built out of stone and wood. Now the king is hereditary. Okay, so it is even better. They're more numerous. What?
So what went wrong in Yoshiyahu? God was like, no.
Yoshiyahu?
Yeah.
They didn't repent fully.
Okay.
They did not fully repent. Because I'll say. Bo l'shilo nes rabamot. So like the Mishnah says, Lo yasham tikra ela beis avanim ilmatam v'yirus b'malam v'hiyai ta menucha. Okay? They came to Shiloh, they built a temple-like structure there, as the Rambam says. Right? And you can see in the Parashah Mishnayos, that was supposed to be. Because there was a structure there, binyan, connected to the ground, that was the menucha as promised in this week's parsha. They settled there and they weren't going to be leaving there. There was no intention whatsoever to move the sanctuary to some other place. God's commandment, no more high places, no more personal altars once you get to the state of menucha. Okay? And the Rambam continues, this is what they were waiting for. Moshe Rabbeinu said, one day you'll find the place where God shall choose, and you shall no longer offer sacrifice there because God will give you rest from all your enemies. That was Shiloh. Now, why is this important? The Rambam continues that he describes all these other places as mikdash. So now I'm going to ask the question, which we'll use this to get to the point. Why is it that only at the very end of his treatise, Hilchos Malachim, the Rambam says, first you get a king, then you get rid of Amalek, and then you build the temple, right? But when he comes to Beis Hilchos Beis Bechira, he says mitzvah saseh to build a temple for God. He doesn't say, and by the way, ve'ein livnot et Beit HaMikdash, and also you shouldn't be able to. Well, I wrote Beis HaMikdash. It should be Beis Bechira ad shen nimaneh olenu melech, until we appoint a king for ourselves. V'nachrit. I wrote narit. Be nachrit. Oh, I'm in English. Okay, English keyboard. V'nachrit et oivenu misaviv. Why is it that when it came to Hilchos Beis Bechira, the Rambam didn't write, and by the way, it's only come time to build this Beis Bechira once we have a king and we've gotten rid of Amalek, or we've gotten rid of all the enemies around us, which include Amalek. Why didn't Rambam write that? Yes, thank you. There never was not a Mikdash. Once you understand more of history, most people, the way they think about this, and the way this little vork goes from the rabbis who are saying it's not time to build a Beis Mikdash, they're assuming King David was on the throne. There was no Beis Hamikdash. Or maybe if they're aware of a little bit of the sugya, they know about bamas and people offered sacrifice. There was no Mikdash. Or even if they're aware of, wait a minute, everything King David did was trying to recover to what he was in the Joshua precedent. He was the second coming of Joshua. He's the Mashiach ben David of Joshua's Mashiach ben Yosef. As a matter of fact, the whole concept of Mashiach ben Yosef and Mashiach ben David, that will have one and then the other, comes from the precedent of first there was Joshua and then there was David. There was a 400-year gap, but that's basically how that way it proceeded in history. Even in Joshua's time, as we point out, everything that there's a parallel, everything we saw in David with Joshua, even in Joshua's time, there was a mikdash. All he did was give it permanence. Make sense? So when someone will claim, yes, maybe it's not time to put the temple back in Jerusalem right now, like a full messianic third temple, that does not absolve us of the constant commandments to have a place, like the Rambam says, Bayis Muchan LaShem. Okay? It should be a place where we have the public sacrifices and pilgrimages and everything else. That's where you're supposed to go. When Joshua set up the Mishkan in Shilo, he had a Mishkan in Gilgal. He just improved on that. Yes, that Mishkan in Gilgal didn't count as the chosen place, and therefore people could have a sacrifice elsewhere, but at least they still had the sacrificial service going on. So too in King David's time. Yes, they hadn't built the temple yet, but there was still a place where you could go and there'd be Kohanim and they'd be doing all the mitzvahs exactly as commanded. So too today, if you want to claim it's not time to build a temple as 100%, we're still supposed to have a minimal place where we could do the basic sacrifices and mitzvahs that are incumbent on us every single day. And that would imply, by the way, that there's no other choice. We have to build a temple. And that's why the Rambam doesn't say today. This was a one-time deal. When it said that order, that was the ideal order. How do we know this? You brought the example of Ezra's time. And if we had more time, we'd open this up. You see in before Ezra even came to Eretz Yisrael, in Zerubbabel's time, they got to building the temple, even though what does it say about their situation? They had their enemies trying to stop them. I'll put this on screen. Maybe it's not, we saw this before. The first thing that they did when the Israelites, the returning Judeans from the Gullus, started building the temple, what happened? It says that Sarai Yehuda came and tried to stop them. They were surrounded by enemies, yet they got to building what? The Beis Hamikdash.
Wasn't one of the person who built the wall of Jerusalem?
No. Nehemiah did that. He was the last comer. First Zerubbabel, then Ezra, then Nehemiah. They had a real security situation. So too, this idea that you have to find Beis Bechira, right? Only once you have a king, and only once you have a respite, applies to the first time you find where to put the temple. That is, they could only ask the Navi, where is the Menucha? Where are we supposed to put the Mishkan now? We're moving out of Gilgal. Now that we've conquered the land and there's peace, where is the Mishkan supposed to be? So Yeshua goes to sleep. He wakes in the morning. Ko Amar Hashem, put the Mishkan in Shiloh and build a temple around it. That's what you're supposed to do. So too with King David, he had peace finally. Then he asked the Navi, where are we supposed to put a permanent temple? But we already know that we're not going back. We have a permanent temple. We don't need a Navi to tell us this anymore. That's why in Ezra's time, in Zerubbabel's time, in Yehuda Maccabee's time, Bar Kokhba's time, they weren't waiting for, let's say, the wars against the Romans to end before getting to build a temple. They failed, by the way, in Bar Kokhba's time. Yehuda Maccabee succeeded. Okay? Right? They put the temple back in order The wars with the Greeks continued. Nicanor Day, when they defeated Nicanor, was after the Hanukkah miracle. That was a secondary Hanukkah miracle. And there were other wars that continued afterwards before they finally had relative peace, right? So too, they tried to build temples. So too in our days. There is no rule, operative rule that says that we have to have peace or we have to have a king in order to put back what should be there already, minimally. This is what Rabbi Elbowen taught me. So I'll sum up these 2 points in English, which is, I think, go over here. What do they say? We just said this, the whole truth. It means a permanent place, a menucha or nachal, without heterbamos. That's what we're talking about. So here's the points. Even if we have no temple, okay, even if we have absolutely no temple, the service must go on every day, right? That's a requirement. And the only way we can do that, by the way, is by doing it in the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. There are people every now and then, you get someone who should know better, or some people are just learning. They say, why can't we build a different base of Mikdash at the Kotel? Why can't we do the Korbanos at the Kotel? Why can't we do this at the Kotel? Why can't we do this on Mount of Olives? The answer is, it's forbidden. Okay, you have to do it on the Har Bayis. So the temple service must go on every day. That we are not absolved of that, even if we don't have peace. And secondly, once the temple is built in Jerusalem, we have a commandment to constantly upkeep it and not neglect it. And what was the proof to this? Second temple history. So this is basically a mistaken halacha when taken too simplistically. The way you have it in the primary sources in the Rambam is that you're supposed to look for the place of permanence of the temple when you get to a certain state in history. We already passed that state in history, so now we just have to put the temple back no matter what, even if we're surrounded by war. Okay? So yeah, it's a problem when people are too simplistic in their understanding of halacha and midrashic ideas. By the way, I saw there are some people getting together. They're having a discussion. How do you recognize the Mashiach? Okay? We want to clarify for people. How will you know it's the Mashiach? And I really don't like those ideas. You know why? Because this idea of, look, Ani Mamim B'Emunah Shalim B'Viyas Mashiach. Don't get me wrong. The problem is that most people think of Mashiach as everything is bad until this point, and the only way, by the way, this is official psak of what could be called the Haredi world and the former chief rabbi among many people. We are not allowed to do anything, we said before, anything that's progressive in the good way, the real progressive, the true meaning of the word in any language. We're not allowed to get anywhere in history, having a state of Israel, in gathering of the exiles, proper governance, a temple. We're not allowed to anything until the Mashiach himself shows up. Until that point, nothing. It's 100% or nothing, right? Only Mashiach. Whereas if you read it properly, Mashiach is an ideal. The messianic state, having like we had in the times of Joshua or Shlomo Melech, that is halavai, and that's always possible. But even if we cannot achieve that, who says we shouldn't try for a King Yehoshaphat or a Chizkiyahu? I'll say he was almost Mashiach. Like the Rambam says, if Mashiach fails to come, you have someone who almost does this, and that doesn't happen. God was testing you. Okay? He was testing you to see if you still believe in God, right? Just a test. But he's like any other of the great Davidic kings who rose in history. The Sabra Rebbe said, the state of Israel is a false messiah. It's just a test. You have to ignore it. No! The Rambam's saying be optimistic. Judaism and Jewish history has had its ups and downs. We've had our ups and we've had our downs, and some of it weren't messianic, but it was still better than nothing. That's why Chazal made the holiday of Hanukkah, for example, right? It wasn't a Davidic monarchy, and there were all sorts of issues. And the Shekhinah, so to speak, didn't return to the temple completely, but there was a sign that they had miracles there also. But it wasn't nothing to sneeze at. We should always aspire to do as much as we can. We should always aspire to have as perfect Jewish leadership as possible. But we shouldn't be disappointed if we were today to find a Davidian to be our king, and he were to almost enforce Jewish law and have significant improvements on temple. He would restart the temple service, but somehow or other, chas v'shalom, he would pass away, and we'd go into another stretch of history with no temple. But there was be a mizbeach, and like in, let's say, Zerubbabel's time, the mizbeach would be reestablished, but it would take a few decades before the temple would be rebuilt. Even that would be permissible. Even that would be better than the current situation. Everybody's celebrating now. You can bow down on the Temple Mount. Can you wear your tefillin? Can you wear your talis? I feel like Yehuda Cook talking about this on Yom Ha'atzmaut 1967. He gave a whole speech. People were celebrating founding of the state. He's looking, most of Jerusalem's still under conquest. Where's Hebron? Where's Beit Lechem? Where's all the holy cities? Is this good enough for you? It's not good enough for me. Okay. So now you're not going to get hurt if you bow down on at the Temple Mount. So many of us took the risk in years past, right? Will they let us take the Arava? Remember what happened 2 years ago? We took the Arava. It's just a stick. It's a twig. So they took it away and they threw in the garbage. They threw away my religious item because chas v'shalom, a Jew should do a mitzvah. Will we be able to get away with that? So my issue was, I don't want people talking about find the Mashiach because they focus too much on Mashiach. It's great, you should aspire to these ideals, but people think it's all or nothing. That's the only way to go about it. Whereas I look at it and saying we should have a Davidic king, and just do what be tamimim, be naive, just try to do as best we can, and God willing, eventually one of these Davidians will turn out to be the Messiah because we'll get there. It could be we'll even have to appoint 10 of these gentlemen over the course of a century before we get 100%. I don't know. I don't know with the future. I'm trying to say that's the point. On Nistarot Hashem Elokeinu, Vaniglot Lanu Vanenu. Haniglot is the present and the past. Nistarot is the future. You don't know, but you have to just do. And same thing with the temple. I don't know what's going to be the future. But when people talk too much about this, like you can only build a temple when Mashiach comes, or it's only going to be like this, you can only do it when you have peace. You're not going to get anywhere. God wants you to do the mitzvahs today. We have questions coming in. We are waiting for Mashiach. Yeah, people say that. How do we tell the difference between the Messiah and just a successful Davidic king? Doesn't the Sanhedrin appoint a king? The Rambam says, really, what's the difference? The answer is every Davidic king could be the Messiah if he succeeds at doing what the Messiah is supposed to do. If we get us back to 100% mode, 100% is the temple is standing and the service is going on and the Torah is the law of the land and we keep all the mitzvahs. Okay, and the exiles are regathered. Doesn't mean every single Jew is in Eretz Yisrael, by the way. It means the majority of Jews are here, because even in Davidic times, there were Jews living in Chutz La'aretz. Okay, it means the majority. The Jews are here. Even Moshe Rabbeinu's time, there are people left the camp. Okay, so you're always going to have Jews who remove themselves from Klal Yisrael. That's how you know it's the Mashiach. Like the Rambam says, if he doesn't check all the boxes, he's just another good Davidic king, Jewish king. So why can't we aspire to that? And God willing, if we have that attitude, we will have the Mashiach. If we have this attitude, we're not allowed to do anything. We have to be completely passive, and Mashiach or bust, then you're going to get nowhere. Okay, so yeah, that's you're going to ask me. Is there an inference brought in the Medrash Halacha and in the Gemara and in Rashi that we are not supposed to build a temple because we don't have peacetime? Say, unfortunately, that's what a superficial reading would indicate. But history and the actual Psak Halacha indicate otherwise. What it means is that you're supposed to always have a temple service. And if, for whatever reason, you're in a time of Heter Bamot, if you live in a time of Heter Bamot, then you should aspire to what? Find the way out of that. That's what King David was asking. Not, I want to build a temple. He's like, I want to get out of the state. Heter Bamot existed before Joshua established the sanctuary at Shiloh. And Heter Bamot existed when David was a young man and when he was first king throughout his reign. It was a little bit longer. The Heter Bamot was extended. In Joshua's time, it was 14 years. In David's time, it was 57 years. 57 divided by 14 is like, four times as long and then some, right? So people are growing impatient. The point was this week's Parsha. If you live in time of Heter Bamot, that's what the pasuk's talking about, which means the temple has no permanence. Aspire to achieve the peace necessary to then find where God wants the temple to be now. But we're already past that. We don't live in a time of Heter Bamot. We live in a time of temple already. And now our goal is to reestablish the temple. Halavai that most scholars were aware of these facts. Whatever, they keep saying the same thing over and over again. They're, lacking nuance and also critical pieces of historical information. So let's learn some Hilchos Beis Bechira. Actually, we're learning Tamidim Musafim, right? Any questions until this point? No. This is. Oh wait, what's there? Who's there? Who's talking?
It's Leon.
Hi.
Hi. It's an interesting catch-22 that we have, that we're not allowed to do anything until Mashiach comes, but we only realize that he's the Mashiach after he's done everything.
Yeah. I said that on the Temple Mount a few weeks ago. You could find the video on YouTube there. It said in the Israeli rabbis. The problem is they tell the Mashiach, you're only the Mashiach if he succeeds. But they're not even going to let him try because they say, "Why are you Mashiach? Prove you're Mashiach. You have to succeed." Circulate. Okay, what are you going to do?
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.